All right, good morning. I'm glad to be with you, and we're going to be talking about American memory in the Second World War, and I've labeled this provocatively the Good War with a question mark. And I hope that in 25 minutes you'll understand why I put that question mark there. So what I'm going to be talking about here is memory, which may seem to be an obvious topic, but I want to make some terms clear before we get going here. So when I talk about memory, I'm talking about public memory or collective memory. So this is very close to or linked to history, but it's not the same thing as history. And this is very important to distinguish. Individuals and societies all like to create certain narratives and ways of dealing with the past, of recalling the past. Usually these are very favorable. We like to curate and pick what we want to remember, how we want to remember ourselves. That doesn't mean that the memories are always happy. You can have some very traumatic memory, but at the same time, it's still selective. Okay? I should also say that to remember also requires forgetting other factors, usually disturbing factors, critical factors, factors that raise troubling or unanswerable questions. So public memory, although not always, oftentimes, I would say in the majority of times, builds towards a consensus. And this leads us to the idea of memory as a social construction. Now, this is a term that academic memory scholars use quite a bit. And when we're talking about a social construction, it means that memory is created, literally created, sometimes tangibly in stone or concrete or brass or nowadays online, but it's created, which means it's subjective and selective and purposeful. Almost always memory is made to create what we call a usable past, and that means a past that serves the present, all right, that usually serves to legitimate the present. If you're talking about maybe a dissident or contrarian or rebellious form of memory, maybe it's built to challenge the status quo. But in either case, the past is invoked to legitimate a cause or a state of affairs, a society, a political regime in the present. Okay, this means that memory is a very political issue. It is almost always created with political intent, which may mean nothing more than someone had to decide. There is an exercise of power to decide which memory to include or to represent and in what form. And memory is changeable. As I'm recording this in late June, we're seeing Confederate monuments being toppled or removed right and left. That brings home very clearly, I think, to an American audience what it means when they say that memory can change. The lifetime, the usefulness, the utility, the validity of those Confederate statues has now, by and large, been expired. Mississippi just agreed to take the Confederate battle flag off the state flag. That no longer speaks to society in 2020. It certainly did in 1920. I think you get the idea. I'll be talking about sites of memory. These are particular places, literal places, where which are very strongly associated with a particular form of memory, a particular memory of something of significance. You can come up for a World War II audience. You can think of Iwo Jima. You can think of Omaha Beach. You can think of Midway or Hiroshima. Any of these places are where something important happened, and memory tends to sort of solidify and gather there through commemorations and memorials and performances of rituals to remember something that we deem it necessary to remember. Representing memory. This is also a memory studies term. When we say we're representing memory, it's how do you take something that happened in the past and make it real to the present. So how do you represent this? And typically, traditional forms have included memorials. Think of the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Memorial, the Iwo Jima Memorial, any sort of historical memorial that you have encountered in your life, wherever, has been a means of representing this. Battlefields, sacred grounds, churches, films are another way to try and represent the past to the present in a certain way. Music, art, the list is almost endless. And finally, the last term which is important is the idea of performing memory. So if representing memory tends to be a static place or thing, performing memory means how we literally reenact or create rituals to mark something of historical importance. And I've given you a few examples of ceremonies and rituals. So we just had Memorial Day. The president always goes to the tomb of the unknown soldier and lays a wreath. That is a performance of memory. We play taps at the end of a ceremony to honor veterans. This is a performance of memory. So it can be concerts, it can be parades, it can be a church service. The list is also almost endless. Now, an individual can certainly perform memory. Someone may remember a certain date that's important. So say that their grandfather died on D-Day on June 6th. And so June 6th may be a very important, even sacred date for that person. And they will maybe mark it individually. But usually we're talking about a collective community effort, where people gather as a congregation in a church or as a community in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier or at a historic site and so on. So these are just some of the ideas that and terms that I may be using over the next 20 minutes. And so to talk about this in a short period of time, I've just broken this up into a couple of highlights. So my presentation will more be touching on these topics, and I'll be delighted to talk about any of these terms in detail or any of these ideas in detail in the discussion period. So I'm first going to briefly point to the resurgence of World War II memory from roughly the 1980s to the present, and the dominant memory certainly has been what I would call the good war paradigm, World War II as the good war. We'll talk in a minute about why it is the good war and why the term is so popular, and why the 1980s. We're going to be looking at what were some of the major drivers behind this memory revival in the 1980s and the 1990s especially. I'll give you some examples from popular culture that represent this good war paradigm. And we're going to be looking at some memorials. Doing very brief sketches of how they are designed and the reactions that they are supposed to elicit. What's the messaging that they give? And then we'll end by looking at dissonant, critical, or contested memory, because although certainly dominant memory, what we call official memory, likes to present itself as sort of the be-all and end-all, right? Being very homogeneous and unquestioned. There are multiple memories of any historical occasion or event or issue, and increasingly we've been seeing dissonant and critical memories come up. Again, speaking in June 2020, I'm referring to the spike, the eruption of dissonant memory about Confederate memorials and the Civil War history and the Confederacy ever since the revival of the Black Lives Matters protests since Memorial Day. That's a contemporary example. And because we need to address this issue of contested memory or critical memory, this is where we need to make the jump from the good war, which I gave you a question mark about, to perhaps a necessary war, which is a term which I personally like better, right? So I certainly think that World War II was a war that needed to be fought. Whether we call it a good war might be a different question. Okay, so let's move forward. And so when I look at the revival of modern American World War II memory, I think a great point to start is President Ronald Reagan's speech in Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1984. And this is known as the speech commemorating the boys of Pointe du Hoc. And so Reagan went for the 40th anniversary, and his advanced team and his speechwriters were looking for a message to give. And this is really important to realize, that memory is always situated in the political necessities, the agendas of the present. So 84, Reagan is running for re-election. He is laying his messages, his version of Make America Great Again. I think it was Morning in America Again or something like that. He's signaling a revival of American pride and American strength and determination to face the Soviet Union and what seemed at that point to be an unending Cold War. He has certain objectives he wants to achieve in the mid-1980s. He wants to place tactical ballistic nuclear weapons in Germany, which was a very contested issue. So the 40th anniversary of D-Day gives him the perfect opportunity, and he seizes, and his speechwriters discover the perfect example to exemplify renewed American spirit, drawing on the legacy of World War II. And these are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. And Pointe du Hoc, this is a point that juts out along the landing zones on D-Day. And the map shows you here that Pointe du Hoc lies right between the two American beaches, the beaches where American forces landed, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. And from this promontory, the Germans had a battery of heavy guns that theoretically could sweep either beach and wreak havoc on the American forces. And so the Army's elite combat soldiers, the Rangers, were given what was called a suicide mission of climbing these 100-foot high cliffs and neutralizing these guns. And they succeeded at heavy cost. So after 3 days of fighting, there's of 90 to 100 men left out of the original 225. And at this point, I'm going to share Reagan's rhetoric. This is the only quote I'm going to be reading you in my presentation, but I think it's important to realize the rhetoric that Reagan used and how what a good speaker he was, and how this rhetoric really sets the basic ideas and themes of the World War II as the good war right down. So this is what Reagan said on 1984. So you have him standing in front of the memorial to the Rangers, and the elderly men sitting around him are veterans, are the Rangers themselves coming to hear him. So he says, "We're here to mark that day in history when the Allied armies joined in battle to reclaim this continent to liberty. For 4 long years, much of Europe had been under a terrible shadow. Free nations had fallen, Jews had cried out in camps, millions cried out for liberation. Europe was enslaved and the world prayed for its rescue. Here in Normandy, the rescue began. Here the Allies stood and fought against tyranny in a giant undertaking unparalleled in human history. We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. The air is soft, but 40 years ago, at this moment, the air was dense with smoke and the cries of men, and the air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of cannon. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs. Their mission was one of the most difficult and daring of the invasion, to climb these sheer and desolate cliffs and take out the enemy guns. The Allies had been told that some of the mightiest of these guns were here, and they would be trained on the beaches to stop the Allied advance. The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy's soldiers, the edge of the cliffs, shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades, and the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. Behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs, and before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. It's magnificent oratory, and it was a home run of a speech. And it was very popular at home, because Reagan, of course, is addressing this to his domestic audience, and succeeded in affirming America's commitment to our NATO allies. And Reagan's celebration of the Rangers here really, I think, is the starting point where we look at the resurgence and the embrace of World War II memory and popular culture in this country over the last 30-some years. Douglas Brinkley's book, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc, this is a really nice case study of how Reagan and his team found this case and played it to their advantage. And in so doing, really made D-Day the center point, I think, of American World War II memory. So I'm going to just give you a couple of the greatest hits, so to speak, of cultural productions, representations behind the revival of World War II memory following Reagan's speech. Certainly, Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, which was published in 1998, was enormously popular and enormously important. Brokaw, as a longtime journalist for NBC, he was covering the 40th anniversary, and at that time in Normandy he interviewed D-Day veterans, and he had a transformative experience. And talking with these veterans, these citizen soldiers, very ordinary guys, Brokaw was just blown away with the courage of these ordinary Americans who had come through the Depression, been raised in the Depression, went over, fought, beat the Nazis or the Japanese, came back and rebuilt post-war America. And so The Greatest Generation is an homage. It's an ode. It's a commemoration of this generation. In 1998, they would have been retired at this point. They would have been in their 70s, but still plenty of them around. And this really sets, along with Reagan's speech, it sets the themes of this generation as hardworking, selfless, courageous, willing to endure, did what they had to do. They're humble, they come back, and they get on with life and build a great society. Also in 1998, so 1998 was an enormous year for World War II memory. The epic film Saving Private Ryan, I'm sure that almost all of you have seen that. It still holds up, it still endures today as a classic of World War II movies. And the themes of Saving Private Ryan, that of the ordinary soldiers. Remember, the squad that Captain Miller leads is made up of a variety of Americans from different backgrounds. The leader, Tom Hanks' character, Captain Miller, is himself a school teacher from Pennsylvania, right? What an ordinary guy who comes through and leads his men into a heroic and sacrificial mission to try and save Private Ryan. This was enormously popular. It won numerous Academy Awards. Its depiction of the landing at D-Day for its time for 98 was revolutionary in the realism it brought to warfare. And it was actually a very important catalyst in helping World War II veterans open up and talk about their experiences. It sort of gave them permission in the popular culture. Tom Hanks was also involved in the HBO series Band of Brothers, which follows one company, Easy Company of the 101st Airborne, from their training and their landing on D-Day and fighting across France and into Germany up until the German surrender. It's really interesting to note, and I hadn't realized this until I was doing research for this talk, that The first episode aired 2 days before 9/11, all right, September 9th, 2001, and its popularity, I think, was extremely enhanced by America going through the immediate post-9/11 trauma, and this, reaching back to the values of World War II, and as the caption here says on this poster, the world depended on them, they depended on each other, of unity, of teamwork, of brotherhood. The title Band of Brother, of course, from Shakespeare's play Henry V, where it's an elite few who have the privilege of daring to fight together like this. And its companion piece, The Pacific, in 2010. Also HBO. This relies heavily on marine memoirs by Robert Leckie and Eugene Sledge. It's a different type of series from Band of Brothers in that it shows the racial animosities, and the depictions of combat are gruesome and without mercy, as the War in the Pacific was a more merciless battle altogether. But these are the two bookends of the HBO series, and again, this reaches a broad popular audience. And the theme of the Good War continues even up until very recently. You may have seen the big budget film Midway. It came out in November of just this past year, and it emphasizes the heroism of Americans under duress. Midway is the turning point of the War in the Pacific, where an outnumbered and outgunned American Navy miraculously defeats a far superior and rather arrogant Japanese fleet. Okay, so the Good War theme of heroism and sacrifice continues and dominates, I would say, even up until this day. Women's roles, I want to include that as well. The Rosie the Riveter image is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So on the left, you see Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover of Rosie. This, of course, represents women going into the workforce. You see Rosie on her lunch break, with her riveting gun there on her lap. She's resting her feet on a copy of Mein Kampf. All right, and you may not have known that detail. And the idea of Rosie the Riveter was extremely popular during the war. There was a pretty bad movie, a popular song, and in 2000, the National Park Service establishes the Rosie the Riveter National Historic Park to commemorate Rosie the Riveter as the emblem of the home front. This is in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and nearby, I believe you can still visit one of the Liberty ships, surviving Liberty ships, because there were large shipyards in this area where the American production cranked out thousands of Liberty ships to help win the war. And so the connection to the women war workers and Rosie the Riveter is quite direct. And along with this, this image I've seen everywhere. I'm sure you have too. The We Can Do It poster. So in the center, we have the original poster from World War II. It's an infinitely applicable and infinitely transferable image, which speaks to the power of this image, I think, about strong and confident women stepping up to the job. So on your left, we have a Mexican Rosie, and I've seen all sorts of Rosies, African American Rosies, Asian Rosies, Latina Rosies. She's become an image that's used for, to say we can do it for groups that are struggling to gain rights and attention. And on your right, a very recent image. This is being painted, a mural in honor of the nurses at a major Dallas hospital, I think in March of this year, as the COVID-19 crisis was breaking out. And so the nurses, the healthcare workers, in the same We Can Do It pose. So I think it's a useful and interesting and a topic your students could certainly explore to see how these images are applied in the present. So in terms of memorials and sites of memory, remember, places that are sacred ground. This is the Normandy Military Cemetery. So right near where Reagan made his speech in 1984. This is featured to bookend the beginning and end of Saving Private Ryan, and military cemeteries with their perfectly aligned rows of crosses and stars of David are designed and purposed to evoke powerful responses among their visitors to commitment of sacrifice and the sense of loss. So for time reasons, I think I won't go through the analysis of these images, but these are some representative, very well-known images that even if we're still doing virtual history, you can go on websites, find numerous images, and take apart the messaging that's being sent about heroism and sacrifice and patriotism in these classic images. So the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, also known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, you see it's positioned so the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C. is very visible there in the background. The connection between the two is not accidental. The Pearl Harbor National Memorial, this is built on top of the remains of USS Arizona, one of the ships sunk in the attack on Pearl Harbor, probably the best known because Arizona blew up and took most of the crew with her. Close to 1,200 sailors died there, and so the memorial's built literally on top of the remains of Arizona, giving a physical link and a visual connection and probably an emotional and spiritual connection between visitors and the losses there. The World War II Memorial, the National World War II Memorial, I know you're going to have a virtual tour of that, so I won't address that directly myself here, but I will point out its location. So you see here on the image on the left, it's directly on an axis between the Lincoln Memorial on the one end and then the Washington Memorial, which you see in the right-hand image on the other. And so this is on the avenue of national history and patriotism, and the symbolic power is overwhelming when you come to think about this. And finally, I'm going to close by looking at sites of dissonant and contested memory. So this is, I think, the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center in Wyoming. This, of course, refers to the internment, or as activists now call it, the incarceration of over 110,000 Japanese, most of them Japanese Americans. That means that means American citizens, out of racial hysteria and bigotry during the Second World War. We'll come to that in a second. Some prime examples, which are easily researchable, and if you want to do case studies on this, this is the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum's failed exhibit on the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Conservative groups at the time objected to this because it would show depictions of the destruction at Hiroshima and on Japanese civilians, and they felt that their good war narrative is going to be threatened. So in 1995, really only the fuselage of the Enola Gay was displayed in the Air and Space Museum. It was an epic fail in terms of memorials. You can now find the entire bomber on display in the Air and Space Museum's Northern Virginia Center. But as a museum exhibit in 1995, at the time, the politics of a Republican-controlled Congress meant that it failed. Japanese internment or incarceration. Again, there's lots of classic images online to show how Japanese were targeted on the basis of their racial identity and sent into camps in desolate locations. This is perhaps the most famous of them. The Manzanar War Relocation Center is now a National Historic Site. Depending where you are, if you're in the West, you can visit Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Minidoka in Idaho. All of these are run by the National Park Service, and a tour, if they ever open up again, they're closed now due to COVID-19, is a powerful experience for students to be on site. So this is sacred ground, and again, this is a contesting contested memory. This is a dissonant memory. It contests the idea of World War II being a good war for freedom and democracy, when at the same time the United States is badly mistreating its own citizens on the basis of race. In my area of the country, in the Pacific Northwest, we have the Panama Hotel in Seattle. This is fascinating. The Panama Hotel was owned by a Japanese businessman, and he opened up the basement of the hotel to receive larger goods that Japanese families could not take with them, so they deposited them there before Seattle area Japanese had to go to these internment camps. And many of these items were never reclaimed after the war, and they sort of slept there unknown for decades until they were refound in the early 2000s. There's a very good and accessible book written for young adults, but it's good for adults too, called On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, for which the Panama Hotel is the pivot of this book about the Japanese internment experience. You can now, this is now a National Historic Landmark. It's recently been named a National Treasure, and you can tour this basement if you're in Seattle and see material evidence of the effects of this war on Japanese. Clint Eastwood's two films about the battle for Iwo Jima, both from the American and the Japanese perspective, in 2006. Flags of Our Fathers gives the American perspective. It questions, however, it shows how the image of the flag raising was manipulated for war bonds, and raises questions about the effects of the war on the soldiers who raised the flag. And Letters from Iwo Jima humanizes the Japanese enemy by telling the story from the Japanese side. African Americans, we know about the Tuskegee Airmen. There was recently, well, in the past number of years, a movie made about them called Red Tails, about the fighter interceptor squadron that accompanied American bombers in Europe. And just recently coming to light, an example of African American women's service, the 6888, right, the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. They were sent to England to clear a backlog of mail, post, 17 million letters and packages that had not been processed. They were given 6 months to untangle the mess. They solved it in 3, and this was recently featured in the New York Times. So the final points I want to make are that history, dates of history and sites of history can be very effectively repurposed. So for various and changing purposes. This illustrates how memory can change over time. So in 2001, for the 60th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, President George W. Bush used the anniversary to invoke the memory of Pearl Harbor in the war against the terrorists who had undertaken the 9/11 attacks. And here he is on USS Enterprise in Norfolk, Virginia, invoking the spirit of invoking Pearl Harbor as the precedent, and vowing that just as we won after Pearl Harbor, so we too would win after 9/11. In 2016, we have, in contrast, we have President Obama here with the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Abe, having both visited the Pearl Harbor Memorial, the first time that a Japanese Prime Minister was there to visit Pearl Harbor, and Obama had visited Hiroshima in May of that same year. So a much more reconciling spirit in 2016 than the Bush speech in 2001. And so to conclude, I just want to show a possibility for new modes of memory. This here is the plaques by the tree in the background. Those list more than the names of over 250 students from my school, Washington State University, known as Washington State College in World War II. They died while serving in World War II. I'm leading a project to build a digital exhibit to give the stories and to revive the memories of these students and to integrate them into the history of our school. And we hope to open that at the end of next year. And so digital exhibits, digital platforms, I think certainly are going to be a major new way of presenting World War II history and making it live for a new generation. And with that, I think I've gone a little bit over time. I apologize for that. I'll be happy to entertain discussion now at this point. Thank you.